everyone, and welcome back to our next Star Trek lore video. We'll be continuing to look at times when Star Trek doesn't make sense. In particular, today we'll be looking at the concept of where is the enlisted crew? Over the course of the Star Trek franchise, the overwhelming majority of both the main and recurring characters that are in the Starfleet have been officers. Now, there are a few notable exceptions, such as Chief O'Brien, for example. But based on real-life ships, there should be a much larger proportion of enlisted crew on a starship. So, to see how much this difference really is, let's look at some real-life comparisons. The following information will be taken from the U.S. Naval Vessel Registry. For example, we have the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, which crew complement includes 571 officers and 5,244 enlisted crew. Now, these large numbers also include the air wing. If you look just at the crew of this ship, you get a similar proportion, although the total crew would be closer to 4,000. Also, looking at a smaller ship, I chose the submarine USS Dallas as an example, which you may be familiar with if you've seen the movie Hunt for Red October. In this case, the submarine has a complement typically of 12 officers and 98 enlisted. So we have a very large crew and a relatively small crew, but in each case the officers only make up approximately 9% of the total crew of the ship. Now, if we applied this to the original Enterprise, which had a crew of 430, that means there would only be around 30 to 40 officers, and the rest of them would be enlisted. However, if you look at the shows themselves, it almost seems like this proportion is reversed. There's very few enlisted and an overwhelming majority of officers. Now, of course, there are some examples of enlisted, the most obvious being Chief O'Brien, as we mentioned earlier, who we also know is the most important person in Starfleet history. And on some of the other shows, there are isolated examples, such as Yeoman Rand on the original series, and Crewman Cutler in Enterprise. However, they are definitely the exception rather than the rule. Is there some way we can find an in-universe reason to justify this disparity? Well, to do that, perhaps let's compare the original Enterprise and the aircraft carrier Enterprise. I know in this specific graphic it is the Enterprise A compared to the aircraft carrier. However, the approximate length would be the same. As I mentioned, the crew of the Starship Enterprise is about 430, and the crew of the aircraft carrier is 5,815. Or if you want to look just at the crew without the air wing, this would be in the neighborhood of 4,000. And you can see from the graphic that the ships are approximately the same length. So, over the hundreds of years of advancement, obviously, ships that are about the same size, the Enterprise in the future requires much fewer crew in total to run the ship than a modern-day aircraft carrier, which would be logical if you think about the advancements in technology that would occur over centuries. And my supposition is that if we want to try to find an in-universe reason, is that many of the jobs that these days would be done by enlisted crew in the future are done automatically or through technology, thus eliminating the needs for large proportions of enlisted crew in Starfleet. If we look behind the scenes, there's actually a real-life reason as to why the various shows in Star Trek have such a low number of enlisted personnel. And this goes back to another one of those weird views of Gene Roddenberry. If you're familiar with some comments made in The Next Generation, for example, you're familiar with Roddenberry's view that Starfleet should not be the military, even though I and many others consider this view to be ridiculous, since Starfleet is clearly the military. However, while I was doing research for this video, I found this following quote from Gene Roddenberry, which can be found in the book The Making of Star Trek. Although the Enterprise is a military vessel, its organization is only semi-military. The enlisted men category does not exist. Star Trek goes on the assumption that every man and woman aboard the USS Enterprise is the equivalent of a qualified astronaut, therefore an officer. At this point, you can see that Roddenberry wasn't quite completely opposed to the Starfleet as a military idea, as he would be later on. But he does adopt an unusual position here that was not completely adopted in the show. Because, as I said, there are still a handful of enlisted crew that you could observe, even though it is still very small numbers. So to summarize our possible fix, and I know this is a stretch because we're talking about a huge difference. However, we could try to argue that the technological advances that occurred between now and the 23rd century, for example, greatly reduced the number of required enlisted crew. So by the time of Star Trek, the majorities of the crews are actually made up of officers and not enlisted. Thank you for joining us again. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I hope you have a blessed day.